Okay, finishing up the book on chapter 25 of The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. Fix this a little bit. She disappeared from a nighttime street in Oceanside, Long Island on March 26, 1985. She was just 19. It was a Tuesday evening and she'd come from a girlfriend's home and she was walking alongside a road to her job at a nearby Burger King. Across the street from Burger King at Nathan's, it was bike night, a Tuesday ritual, although it was just 7:40 p.m. The weekly leathered hordes were revving their Harleys in the parking lot, but Jacqueline Martorella wouldn't see the bikers, would never reach her job. Jacqueline Martorella vanished in the early spring darkness. As soon as I read of this disappearance, I suspected foul play. I knew Jacqueline wasn't a runaway, nothing fit, but I knew more than that. I was already involved in a probe of possible cult complicity in another disappearance and a murder, both involving young girls in the village of Lynbrook, a few miles from Oceanside. When the Martorella disappearance was announced, I and some in law enforcement thought the cases were probably linked. In early March, Harry Daly, a writer and stunt coordinator for films, called me at my new residence in Jersey. Aware of what was going on around his community, he asked if I'd come to Long Island to look into the cases. Daly was a friend of Dennis Dillon, the Nassau County District Attorney. Dillon, Harry said, was concerned about the matter and would be willing to discuss the situation with me, and so I went. Two teenagers, Kelly Maurici and Teresa Fusco, had recently vanished from the streets of Lynbrook in the early evening hours. Maurici, 15, was still missing, but Fusco's body was later found buried beneath pallets in a wooded area near the Long Island Railroad tracks in Lynbrook. She'd been raped, strangled, and dumped nude in the cold November air. She lay there a month before her body was discovered. Teresa Fusco was 16. Dennis Dillon explained that there'd been a series of incidents in recent months in Nassau County as some witnesses spotted a van apparently occupied by more than one person, cruising the areas from where the victims vanished. By definition, any conspiracy of more than two people engaging in multiple killings is a cult, I said. What kind of cult it is remains to be seen. I'm concerned about these incidents, Dillon said. I'm aware of what you've done on Berkowitz, and if you've got any ideas here, I'd be glad to hear them. I told Dillon I'd like to visit the Fusco scene, and he gave Harry and me directions to find it. At the site, we examined the pallets which had covered Teresa's body. On one, there was faded writing in magic marker. The word Rush appeared, the name of a heavy metal rock group. Beside it was a symbol the group used, the Satanic pentagram. On another part of the same panel, a message was written. Some words were obliterated, but what we could decipher said, "Sex, no, virgin devil, allow." We didn't have to be hit over the head. For years I'd known that the rape of a young virgin was an important satanic ritual, and so was murder. Pulling the planks from the pallet, we turned them over to Dillon. "Somewhere out here there's probably a cult working," I said. "I find it hard to believe she just happened to be covered with a pallet that had that crap written on it by accident, but maybe on a long shot it is a coincidence. I think we have to learn more." Dillon agreed. He wasn't prepared to call it a cult killing either, but Harry Daly, who'd carefully scouted the village of Lynbrook, pointed out that an unusual abundance of satanic and Nazi graffiti peppered certain hangouts in the town. He thought there was significance in that fact, and there was. Much of the graffiti was sophisticated, and the Nazi connection was important. I was beginning to envision a link to the biker crowd in Oceanside. Many bike gangs are satanically oriented, a fact not lost on the process and Charlie Manson, both of whom actively sought to recruit bikers as the advanced troops of Armageddon, and in large letters the word "Rise" appeared among the occult graffiti at one location in Lynbrook. Manson's killers wrote that word in blood in the La Bianca home. I also remembered Vinny's comment about the Sam cult using bikers to transport illegal weapons. Still, neither Dylan Daly nor I knew if we were dealing with an organized cult, a few satanically bent young men, or a coincidence. An arrest was in the offing in the Fusco case, and John Cogart, 22, was picked up on March 25th. His apprehension was announced the next day, and Jacqueline Martorella vanished 8 hours later in Oceanside, about 4 miles from the Fusco scene in Lynbrook. While the police searched for Martorella, Harry Daly and I went back to work on John Cogart's background. 2 other men were believed to have been his accomplices in the Fusco killing, and authorities were building toward their arrests. Cogart had named them into his confession, but Cogart himself had a history which contained some fascinating clues. A landscaper, he'd been a street kid most of his life, in and out of minor trouble. He was typical of the genre, but there was something else. A witness told us Cogart had once burned a cross into his arm and had shown the witness pornographic snapshots of himself. He said he was involved in porno stuff, the witness explained. Shortly afterward, Newsday reporter Sid Cassis, who'd been working with Harry and me, found out about Cogart's porno connection. He apparently was arrested as a male prostitute in New York City while still in his teens. Homosexuality, porn, and New York City tie-ins, I was beginning to discern a familiar pattern. But the most important development was still to come. Seeking information, Cassis was loitering outside a Lynbrook video games emporium, was en route to a Friday night party with a companion. Stopping to talk for a few minutes, Fletcher told Cassis that Cogart was indeed into the pornography business in Manhattan, and had even starred in a private underground child porn film. Its title was 5 to 9, a perverted play on the movie 9 to 5. Cassis wanted to interview Fletcher again, but he never got the chance several hours after talking to the reporter. Fletcher was blown away by a shotgun blast to the head outside his cousin's home in nearby Rosedale, Queens. Fletcher was dead, and Sid Cassis was a shaken man. The incident occurred about 4:30 a.m., and it happened in the middle of the street. No gun was found, yet authorities thought Fletcher, who had a history of emotional difficulties, might have taken a shotgun from the house, walked into the roadway, and killed himself. As for the missing shotgun, police suggested someone in the house may have taken it from its place near the body. The other possibility was that Fletcher was murdered. The matter was unresolved, but Cassis said Fletcher was in good spirits when he spoke to him hours before. And then Jacqueline Martorella was found. Like Teresa Fusco, she was nude, ligature strangled, and apparently raped. Her body was found in late April 1985, hidden in tall reeds adjacent to the 17th hole of the Woodmere Country Club in exclusive Lawrence, Long Island, about 5 miles west of the spot from which she disappeared. In a day, I was at the scene, and there in the reeds, about 15 feet deeper into the rushes than the body, I found it. It was one of the signs left at crime scenes by the Sam cult. I'd known about this proclivity since 1981, and Dennis Dillon knew it too, because I'd shown him a present letter listing this and a few other objects this group often left at murder scenes. For investigatory reasons, the object must remain unidentified, but it was not an item one would expect to find hidden near a murder victim. The object had been carefully placed, and it was apparently The object had been carefully placed, and it was apparent it was there for about the same length of time as the body, approximately a month. Its presence told me all I needed to know, and it telegraphed once again what I'd realized all along: the cult hadn't disbanded. Elements of it were still active. I also recalled something Berkowitz had written in 1979. They will just replace me. There are others. Yes, others like Berkowitz who, if arrested, would say nothing about the cult activities and assume sole responsibility for the crimes. Over the years, police undoubtedly had apprehended people they believed were solo operators but were actually connected to the cult underground, but nobody knew it. I called Dennis Dillon from a nearby restaurant and drove to the scene from his office in Garden City. It was a cold, blustery April day, and the wind blew hard off the inlet water which lapped at the golf course. "That's it," I said, handing him the object. "Now we know what we're dealing with on Mardarilla, at least. I don't see how this can possibly be a coincidence, and I'd say there's probably some kind of link to Cogert's crowd, even if it's a loose one. This thing is a magical symbol for them," I explained, pointing at the object, "but nobody else would think it was the slightest bit relevant." "I know what you're saying," Dillon nodded, "but this is a police case to solve. I'm the prosecutor. We'll just have to wait and see what they come up with." I understood what Dillon meant. Outside investigators, even if welcomed by a district attorney, are not appreciated by police departments whose job it is to solve cases in their jurisdictions. Anything viewed as interference, however slight, is met with resentment. However, within a week, Dennis Dillon was back at the Mardarilla scene, and as before, it was a telephone call that brought him there. Harry Daly, interfering in police business, was asking questions in the neighborhood surrounding the golf course. He learned from a mailman that behind the course, in a secluded wooded section about 600 yards from where the body was found, a small cave sat in a clearing. The postman had never looked inside, but he thought we might be interested in knowing it existed. We were. Inside the cave, which was actually an abandoned root cellar from an estate that had stood on the property years before, we found shocking upturned crosses and other satanic slogans. Outside the cellar, which resembled a bunker, were a white half-glove and leotard undergarment that Jacqueline's father, Marty Mardarella, soon identified to us as very similar to the articles Jacqueline owned. When he looked in his daughter's room, her similar clothing was nowhere to be found. Now we can make a pretty good call on why she was taken about 5 miles from where they nabbed her, I later said to Harry. "You mean they took her to that place, killed her there, if she wasn't already dead, and then just drove her out into the golf course and hid the body in the reeds?" "It looked that way," I agreed. "And they left their calling card near the body." "These cops have got to be blind," Harry said. "They missed all of this." But the Satanic cellar contained another secret, one we ourselves missed at first. It was buried in a pile of leaves on a musty dirt floor. It was a hand-printed note, one comprised by a serious Satanist. It was a bastardization of the Book of Revelation, one of the sources of the Sam cult's theology, and Charles Manson's as well. Gingerly picked up the damp aging paper. We read the note. "Woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil sends his beast with wrath. Let he who has understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666. "Good God," Harry whispered. "Hello, John Carr's hand. This is big league stuff," I replied, "and one of their favorite symbols, too. Take a look over your head. That's not General MacArthur up there." Harry peered upward through the gloom, and the message really began to sink in. Next to a black pentagram and a painted upturned cross were the chilling words, "I will return." "That's Satan's return to earth," I said quietly. "Like the note, it's a warning. The same thought was conveyed in the Son of Sam Borelli letter 8 freaking years ago. I'll be back. I feel like I'm on some Hollywood set, Harry muttered nervously. I only wish we were. The note was turned over to Dennis Dillon, who drove down from Garden City to examine the bunker himself. The letter's existence and that of the seller weren't made public, although a local weekly newspaper, learning of the bunker from its own sources, later wondered if it might have some link to the slaying. In May 1986, John Cogart was convicted of Teresa Fusco's murder. In the interim, we learned that a close friend of his from nearby Long Beach was a Satanist, but there was no evidence linking him to any crimes. Cogart, in his confession, said Fusco was raped and strangled in a Lynbrook cemetery before being placed beneath the pallets in the woods near the railroad tracks, only blocks from where she disappeared. Two alleged accomplices, whom Cogart named in his confession, were later arrested and convicted in that case. Also in the spring of '86, someone close to Teresa Fusco said Teresa had knowledge of a satanic cult that was operating in Oceanside and Long Beach. Kelly Maury, who was an acquaintance of Fusco and of the other men accused of that murder, was still missing and presumed dead. Besides her knowing Fusco, entries in Maury's diary revealed that she had dated John Cogart. There was little doubt that Maurici and Fusco cases were linked, along that of Jacqueline Martorella, whose family said she was acquainted with members of Cogart's circle. At the same time, other murders of young girls continued to occur in the Nassau County region, and as of early 1987, the slaying of 19-year-old Jacqueline Martorella remained unsolved. As soon as the news broke that a decaying body was found in a smokehouse on a rural estate in suburban Tompkins Cove, New York, I began paying close attention. The body, partially eaten by animals, was discovered on the private property of John Legueros on March 17, 1985. It turned out it had been there since the pre-dawn hours of February 23rd. Thompson's Cove, a small community in Rockland County, lies across the Hudson River from Westchester, some 30 miles northwest of Manhattan. Legueros was an American citizen employed in an executive capacity by the United Nations, and the presence of this rotting body was an embarrassment of no small consideration. The case caught my eye because the corpse's head was encased in a black leather bondage hood. Myriad possible connections spun through my mind. The body was soon identified as that of Egil Dag Vesti, 26, a Norwegian fashion model and homosexual who lived on West 26th Street in the Chelsea section of Manhattan. Vesti had disappeared the night of February 22nd. He was known to frequent the Limelight Disco, also in Chelsea, and downtown homosexual S&M clubs like the Hellfire and the Mine Shaft. By now, I was really interested. On March 22nd, Bernard Legueros, 23, the son of John Legueros, was arrested and charged with murder. Vesti had been shot twice in the back of the head, stabbed, and the coroner believed mutilated to attract devouring animals to the corpse. But Legueros added more to that account. He confessed that he and a millionaire Manhattan art dealer, Andrew Crispo, 45, had driven Vesti to Legueros' estate, and there, at Crispo's direction, Legueros shot and handcuffed and hooded Vesti in the back of the head in the bizarre culmination of a sick S&M ritual. Crispo, a homosexual, had met Vesti the night in the Hellfire, according to Legueros' attorney. Murray sprung. After snorting a considerable amount of cocaine provided by Crispo, Vesti was enticed to travel upstate to the Legueros property. The plan was the ultimate sacrifice, murder. Legueros stated that Crispo had told him to shoot Vesti twice, one to kill Vesti's body and one to kill his soul. Ligero said that Vesti's blood was drunk, a satanic practice, and that Crispo sexually penetrated knife wounds in the victim's body. The heart was also cut out. Legeros confessed, and the body then set on fire. Legeros wasn't homosexual, but he'd been hired to work in Crispo's West 57th Street art gallery and was soon turned into Crispo's slave. He was said addicted to the vast amounts of cocaine Crispo supplied. Crispo used Legeros as an enforcer. The art dealer, according to numerous sources and official complaints, was said to have lured gay men to a back room of the art gallery where they were tied up and whipped by Legeros, who sometimes dressed as a police officer. Crispo, according to an associate of Legeros, Billy Meyer, had a Hitler fantasy and reveled in the notion of Nazi uniforms. This, too, was another link to the Sam cult. Author Anthony Hayden, guest who published a major story about Crispo in New York Magazine, added another compelling lead when he had told me Crispo had spoken about snuff films and a contact for them in Houston. And in addition to his Manhattan dealings, the wealthy Crispo owned a home in Southampton, Long Island. That did it. In Dennis Dillon's office in the early spring of 1985, I asked the district attorney if he'd do me an important favor. Roy Radin used to keep lists of guests from some of his parties. I explained, I haven't seen any, but I know they exist. His place was raided out there in 80 and 81. Would you mind contacting someone out there to see if you can pry one of those things loose? Sure, Dillon replied. What are you looking for? Andrew Crispo. A week later, I was back in Dillon's office. He gave me a puzzled look and handed me a large typewritten piece of paper. It was the guest list from Radin's 1981 wedding. There were numerous names on the alphabetized roster. I circled one for you, Dillon said. I don't know how the hell you were so sure. I looked down at the page and there it was, Andrew Crispo. That really doesn't surprise me, I said. I remember what the prison informants said about the big money people being involved in this stuff. Here we have Roy Radin tied into murder, S&M, snuff films, bisexuality, and cult activity. Now we have his buddy Andrew Crispo tied into exactly the same things, including one of the sickest murders I've ever heard about. Now, Dennis, do we call this coincidence? Dillon smiled. No, we don't, he replied. Anthony Hayden, guest, soon filled in some additional blanks. Crispo said Anthony Hayden, guest, soon filled in some additional blanks. Crispo, he said, was allegedly involved in extensive cocaine dealings and was definitely a friend of Radin's pal Paul Hill, who delighted in 13-year-old girls and whose townhouse was known as the Nursery. Hill's supposed to be hooked on heroin himself now, Hayden guest explained. He was a good friend of Radin and was close to Crispo too. That makes sense, I replied, and showed Hayden guest the list. Hill's name was also on it. Because of the sensitivity of the investigation, I wasn't able to tell Hayden guest what I was looking into, but he graciously offered to help anyway. Andrew Crispo didn't deny that he was at the scene of the murder, but did deny ordering it. When called to testify at Legeros' trial in September 1985, he took the Fifth Amendment over and over again. Because of New York state law concerning the testimony of a conspirator, Crispo couldn't be charged with murder on only the statements of Legeros. However, the Rockland County District Attorney's Office was still trying to build an independent case against Crispo as of early 1987. Meanwhile, the debonair art dealer was sentenced to prison for evading some $4 million in taxes. If nothing else, he was on the shelf for a while. Legeros was convicted of murder, accompanied by Hank Sinodi. I made it a point to attend his trial. From the witness stand, another conclusive piece of evidence was revealed. However, we were the only people in attendance who knew its significance. Dr. Frank Vares, a Manhattan psychiatrist who examined Legueros, told the packed courtroom Legueros had revealed that Crispo was part of a satanic cult which drank the blood of its victims. The doctor testified that Crispo, encouraging the drinking of Bestie's blood, told Legueros to drink the blood. We always drink the blood in the cult. Case closed for me. A search that began in New York 8 years earlier and traversed the country several times and was now being dramatically confirmed again in a Rockland County courtroom. In the hallway during a recess, New York Post reporter Bill Hoffman approached me. "Did you hear that?" he asked, and then stopped. "Is that why you're here? Does this have anything to do with the Son of Sam?" "I'd just say it's a hell of a case, but you might be interested in going strong with that cult comment in your story today. Bill, you wouldn't be on the wrong track if you did." Hoffman's Post article on the trial the next day was headlined, "DOC Crispo in Satanic Blood Drinking Cult." Steve Dunleavy, the Metropolitan editor at the Post, had a good memory. The following morning I approached Ken Marshall, Legueros' co-counsel, and asked him what he thought of the cult testimony. "We've been dealing closely with Bernard for months now," he said. "We think he's told the truth about it." "So do I. For a host of complicated reasons, I'm trying to follow up on that angle. It might even affect Bernard's case someday, but I don't know." I then asked Marshall if Legueros might be willing to answer several questions I'd written out, and the lawyer said he'd do what he could. After the lunch break, Marshall and I leaned against a windowsill in the hallway outside the courtroom. Legueros had replied to the inquiries, and Marshall read me the answers. "There was indeed a satanic cult," Legueros said, "and Crispo was in it. And so were a number of other wealthy people in Crispo's circle. There were other bodies buried somewhere," Crispo told him. Some, Legueros believed, were in Southampton. He didn't know where any others might be, but he was told there were more. The cult had tapes or snuff films of murders. He hadn't seen any, but Crispo told him about them. Crispo had in fact talked about blood-drinking ceremonies in the cult, Legueros said. Legueros hadn't known Crispo for very long, so he wasn't familiar with the names of most of Crispo's friends, he said. But yes, Crispo had spoken about Roy Radin. Crispo knew Roy Radin. Crispo had also talked a lot about Paul Hill. Legueros didn't know if Radin was in the cult, but he believed Hill was. Crispo also spoke about a Philip he knew in Los Angeles. Legueros didn't know Philip's last name. I was looking for a connection to Phil Benson and perhaps had found it. I had just received information that Benson was involved in an art theft operation in Los Angeles. Legueros said he himself wasn't a member of the cult that was restricted to Crispo's rich friends, so far as he knew. Legueros, ignorant of why the questions were put to him, had just confirmed everything the prison informants had said years before. Roy Radin was dead well before Legueros met Crispo, so his incomplete knowledge of the Crispo-Radin relationship was consistent with the chronological facts. I already knew from the Radin guest list that an association existed between him and Crispo. Legueros just bolstered it and added to what we previously learned about the wealthy Paul Hill. Later evidence surfaced that another affluent Manhattan social figure of considerable prominence was connected to both Hill and Crispo. This man, said to be bisexual, was closely associated with a woman who professed to be a witch. The man was alleged to be part of a circle of necrophiliacs who gathered late at night in select Manhattan funeral parlors to engage in sexual activities with attractive corpses of either sex. Checking with the beat cops who worked in the man's precinct, I learned that they too had heard of his bizarre conduct. At the conclusion of the Legatos trial, I met with Rockland County investigator Jim Stewart, who was involved in the Vesti case from the outset and served as courtroom aide to DA Ken Gribbets, who personally prosecuted Legatos, advised the jury that he intended to pursue Andrew Crispo for his alleged role in the murder. I told Stewart and Lieutenant Frank Tanilli of Stony Point what we'd developed. I knew the background details wouldn't directly build their case against Crispo in the Vesti killing, but as intelligence data they might prove valuable. We think it's possible there may be another body in two in Rockland, Stewart said. We don't know it for a fact, but it's a suspicion. I'm afraid there may be a number of them here and there, I agreed. We're just going to keep moving ahead from our side of the fence. We may cross paths sometime in the future. In Rockland, the Crispo investigation would continue, and authorities later told me they'd also unearthed evidence of Crispo's cult involvement. One man said to be part of Crispo's circle was a famous makeup artist who subsequently died. Our own inquiries in both New York and California would extend through year-end as well. We'd now come full circle. We'd followed the trail of death and violence from coast to coast and back again, and the vicious crimes continued throughout that journey of 9 years. And then, once more, it was summer. For 11 months each year, the world I now inhabited was too often strafed by the depraved and the tragic. But in July, as always, I sought out one of the few constants in my life. In Davis Park on Fire Island, precious little changed from summer to summer, no matter what wars were waged between August and June. The open arms of the ocean always beckoned in July. The sea, the sparkling beach, the people and tranquil waterside mood were perennially waiting. There, it seemed, time stood still, and with the Atlantic crashing beside me, I could once more dance through a world of never-was and dream and tell myself that none of it had happened, if only that was so. On July 31st, 1986, the anniversary of the shooting of Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, I aimlessly walked the night beach alone. 9 years before, a brilliant orange moon hung low in the summer sky and shimmered off a quiet sea. That night, Stacy's tragic end had been my own beginning. Now I needed to reflect. In the years since that summer of Sam, I'd roamed a netherworld I wouldn't have believed it existed then. That was my age of innocence, and it was gone forever. I'd never wanted to discover that such a terrifying subculture menaced America, but it lived and thrived. And it was growing. I'd come to know that very well, as did many others who traveled parts of that precarious road with me. Together we ventured into that nightmare world and out again, and it changed us all, in one way or another. With few exceptions, those people were strangers to me on July 31st, 1977. Now, although many remained behind as the hunt moved through and beyond their states and jurisdictions, a bond remained. For that I was grateful. Those people, prosecutors, press, police, and others, defied the system. They cared. They cared a hell of a lot, and their contributions were invaluable. And so, too, were there of the unexpected partisans of several convicts who, at considerable personal risk, reached out to convey information they knew was too important to languish as they did behind prison walls. The roster of the dead was never far from my mind, so many people connected to the case who were alive that night in 1977 had been murdered or died violently since, and some of those had been under our close scrutiny when the end came. Arrests were not in my realm, but I couldn't help but recall a comment Lieutenant Terry Gardner once made. "You got them one way or another, don't you?" If that was so, the satisfaction was slim, but maybe in my own way I had managed to influence a justice that was beyond the reach of the courts. If so, verdict was fate's, It was meant to happen as it did. In various jurisdictions, investigations continued. In Queens and California especially, authors still sought answers to questions which plagued them for years. The hope was that some final pieces might soon fall in place. I believed arrests were possible in some of those cases. As I wandered past the lonely dune house that marked the western border of Davis Park, I inventoried the murders. Yes, I thought, persistent investigation could still bring killers to justice, and the slaying of Christine Freund, Virginia Volkerichain, Stacy Moskowitz, Arliss Perry, and Roy Radin, and success in any of those areas would certainly open doors to others. It is imperative that one of those portals swing open soon. From every indication and piece of evidence I'd gathered, the ominous signs pointed to a burgeoning cult movement in and around New York, Houston, and Los Angeles at the least. These cities were part of the organized network, and its membership ranks, I learned, were steadily growing, populated to a large extent by young and successful people from professional walks of life. These, in turn, would align with the successors of David Berkowitz and the Carr brothers, and beyond the umbrella parent group, independent cults were springing to life in virtually every state of the United States of America. In many instances, these groups would seek alliances with the old order, and some would do so successfully. In my own investigation, things kept happening right into July 1986, just weeks before we arrived on Fire Island. The Los Angeles area social club we'd linked to the Sam cult was torched. Arson, and the blaze was ignited at the same time inquiries about the club were being made. Of the many highlights during the years of the investigation, the work done on Phil Benson was one endeavor which would forever occupy a prominent place in my mind. We didn't have a name. We didn't have an address. We had my analysis of the Radin, Freund, and Perry scenes and information provided by Vinnie Danamora. And yet, out of some 250 million people, we traced one man across nearly 2 decades and made the impossible link a reality. But such efforts extracted a toll. I, for one, was weary. Walking the night beach, I wanted to step away from it all and never look back. The path I'd traveled was one marked by persistent tension, and always there lurked the shadow of danger. Moreover, when one infiltrates the darkness for so long, it is easy to forget the sun is still shining somewhere. I'd spent too many years living on the edge. It was time to search for a safe harbor. By year-end 1986, every meaningful bit of information we had developed on any of the cases or suspects would be in official hands. It was probably good that I would soon complete my involvement in the various investigations, but again, that's why I came to Fire Island, to ease some frustrations and to think things through and work them out. I'd been there 9 days and my reason was beginning to rhyme again. And after an hour on the sand, I felt better. It was time to turn east and head back to the house into the wind now. I felt invigorated and relaxed. I inhaled deeply a gust of salty night air and blew in from the sea, pushing a rising tide of optimism, of hope. Family and friends were waiting at the beach house, among them the same group that had gathered on the dune stairs to discuss the ongoing Son of Sam case 9 years before, and it was still ongoing. With my recollection, my mind cleared, and I wasn't tired any longer. The focus remained on the West Coast. New information which made its way to me in mid-July 1986 was specific. Not only was the Chingon cult still active, it had now established strong financial ties with a private college in the Los Angeles area. The cult's wealthy leaders were said to be funding the institution, and satanic activity was in fact flourishing on the campus. At the same time, police in the Los Angeles area and two former LA Satanists sent word that an East Coast cult branch allied with the Chingons, the Black Cross, was operating as an elite hit squad for various U.S. satanic groups involved in drug and pornography enterprises. Obviously, the narcotics and child porn details further confirmed earlier New York prison allegations. And as for the Black Cross itself, it appeared to be closely linked to the Sam cult in New York and existed for one purpose: murder. Its function, the California Contact said, was the elimination of defecting cult members and other enemies, including innocent people who inadvertently learned about a given group's illegal activities. Murder anywhere in the country was now but a phone call away for the cults tied into the Chingon network. I flew to Los Angeles in late January 1987 to interview investigators and sources on the various cases. Authorities in Southern California reported that they too had become aware of the California-New York cult link, saying that evidence existed of a cult-operated child porn network and that they were studying possible connections of Phil Benson and his acquaintances to it. In New York, where David Berkowitz has remained silent for several years, there were new developments, one of which was especially ominous. Yonkers residents who lived near Untermeyer Park stated that the cult was active there once again. The group was observed by witnesses, and I was given recent photos of mutilated dogs, which documented the neighbors' reports. The group's return brought to mind another disturbing aspect of the entire investigation: the realization that the cult movement, which had been bent toward violence since at least the late 1960s, was still expanding while law enforcement remained virtually powerless. Few police understood this type of conspiracy. Most couldn't relate to it. Mimicking law enforcement, Vinny once wrote, the insane always act solo. The group is well aware of this cop attitude and uses it to their advantage. Through experience, I knew that Vinny was essentially correct. Police departments tend to rapidly close the books after arrests, seldom were they inclined to delve beneath the surface. That posture had, beyond question, figured in the expansion of the satanic cult movement. Thus, the occasional arrests of an isolated, supposedly lone criminal had little perceptible impact on the group's master plans. But there are indications that a change might be in the wind. On February 26, 1987, the Interfaith Coalition for Concern About Cults conducted a day-long seminar on Satanism for members of law enforcement. The conference, which was held at the Archdiocese of New York in Manhattan, was attended by 120 police officials from the New York tri-state area. Moreover, the New York City Police Department itself is being governed by a new regime, one which cannot be held accountable for any transgressions that may have been committed by its predecessors. There are, in fact, indications that the 1987 department is not adverse to broaching areas of investigation that were once deemed untouchable. Whoever intervenes, the involvement is necessary. There is compelling evidence of the existence of a nationwide network of satanic cults, some aligned more closely than others. Some are purveying narcotics, others have branched into child pornography and violent sadomasochistic crime, including murder. I am concerned that the toll of innocent victims will steadily mount unless law enforcement officials recognize the threat and face it. Unlike some of those authorities, I've been there. I know how serious the situation is. The torch that was put into Manson's hand in 1969 was never extinguished. It was instead passed to Berkowitz and others, and the violence and depravity continued. The evidence demonstrates that the force behind that carnage was in place before and after Manson and Son of Sam slayings, and lurking in various guises is still there. A letter Vinny sent me in the wake of the Roy Raiden murder in 1983 said, "When will they learn that I've only told the truth?" Yes, it sounds fantastic, but so many true things sound fantastic. Let's see, what number of victims is this now? You know, in another 2 years there won't be anyone left to capture. Oh yes, there will, and their numbers are growing. And this time, there is no insulating Middle America. This time, it isn't an inner city eruption that can be written off as the inevitable fallout from poverty and slums. No, this battleground is elsewhere. The list of the dead tells that story. The killer cults were born and nurtured in the comfort zone of America and are now victimizing it at will. Manson's haunting testimony and a later warning from David Berkowitz echoed loudly across the years. Two statements made on opposite coasts nearly a decade apart, yet the dire message is the same. What about your children? Oh, crap. What about your children? Manson challenged a Los Angeles courtroom as the 1970s began. You say there are just a few. There are many, many more coming in the same direction. They are running in the streets, and they are coming right at you. In New York, Berkowitz would write, "There are other sons out there. God help the world. Sometimes, late at night, one can know the truth of their words. Through the darkness, a foreboding wail can be heard, faintly at first, then more insistent and nearer. The reverberations ring through urban canyons, roll across the shadowed byways of Scarsdale and Bel Air, and are carried on the night wind to remote reaches of rural countrysides. It is a mournful, curdling cry. It is the sound of America screaming." And we are finally done. Good God.